Welcome everyone to our Seaside Chats. This is Morgen Ayers, and Morgan, take it away.
Good afternoon. Thank you everyone for your attendance and your time this afternoon. Before we dive into coastal restoration, we have a quick question, a poll that Drew will launch. If you don't mind answering that, we would appreciate it. Just give everyone a few moments to select an answer. And this is just so we can better tailor programs, and we appreciate you participating. All right. So I will go ahead and get into it. As Drew said, I'm Morgen Ayers. I'm a natural resources specialist with Texas Sea Grant. I was brought on in the summer of 2018. And as part of Texas Sea Grant's strategic plan, healthy coastal ecosystems are one of the 4 focus areas. And that is the area that I am most focused on. So within this presentation today, this restoration is a way that we promote the wise use and stewardship of Texas coastal and marine resources, which is the mission statement. And this slide, I know it's quite busy. It's just to show that the complexity and interconnectedness of ecosystems and why it takes a village to manage and educate and have partnerships to best steward these systems, which are all unique. So there's not a one size fits all. And that's, the local stakeholders, researchers, agencies, they all have knowledge that together will work towards coming up with that unique site-specific approach. So just kind of to put on a little bit of a scale, on a category scale, sometimes the best way to restore is not to intervene or make changes to a particular ecosystem, and that, these 3 choices, which are just, broad and put in broad language, but they all depend on what you determine after you assess and after you talk to the community and get historical knowledge and research. And sometimes you find that you do need moderate alterations, which would be classified more as enhancing, which is a component of restoration. It's just not as significant amount of boots on the ground work. So it might be that you're adding native plants and you are, maybe you expand the area that is protected or conserved. And for significant restoration, you're heavy boots on the ground. Some examples of removal might be at the invasive species. Sometimes you're removing debris to help promote the health of that habitat and reduce the impacts on that wildlife that depends on it. And then inputs could be seeding, bringing in plants. For shorelines, that could be bringing in cobble to help stabilize erosion. And also you see combination restoration where you have oyster reefs built out from where you've planted a marsh, for example, so that it helps with wave attenuation, so those waves aren't impacting the new plants as much while they get established. And then some other breakdowns of how complex restoration can be. Just the parts you assess, you you research if necessary. We've gone over how you rely on historical data and really heavily lean on community, especially stakeholders that have been in the area for a while. Some of them, have worked on natural resource issues and then have retired and stayed there, or have fished the area for years. So partnerships, planning process just to build capacity and make the best use of the resources you have, to make the success more likely and more sustainable. And then you execute, or you implement, depending on if it's a on the ground restoration, you execute that. Or if you come up with, for example, you're doing a conservation easement or land acquisition, then that gets executed, and it's put into it's protected for often no development, and it stays, depending on the details of that arrangement. And so this slide's just to emphasize why is Sea Grant a crucial partner to this type 2 restoration on the coast. And it's that we are uniquely positioned with extension agents out in the field and researchers that we fund and others that we work with to ensure that the community needs are translated, or that those researchers are informed what needs more study, where your data gaps are, what would be most beneficial to communities, and then communities also learn about tools and latest research, and they understand the science behind management decisions. So this is just a quick list of different types. Often I think, and myself included, when I thought of restoration before, it was always a picture of, planting a marsh, which is a very effective and great type of project. But I would think of wetlands or riparian planting, but you also can restore dunes, living shorelines, different community ecosystem communities that are more inland, but still with, considered coastal lands. So Live Oak, Red Bay. You can do beautification projects. We talked about land acquisition, and that's conserving and preserving a piece of land that often you select because of the crucialness of it, or its critical habitat for an endangered or threatened species, or it provides buffer against storms and flooding. Then you have oyster reefs. You can remove invasive species, and that's sometimes managing, for example, not just plants, but for example, feral hogs in Texas are a huge invasive problem, and they destroy millions and millions of acres of cropland, and they disturb streamside vegetation. So they, we don't always think about them to do, feral hogs when you think about restoration, but managing that does allow lands to be protected. Then we mentioned already cleanups and removal and enhancement. So we'll get into some examples of success that Texas Sea Grant has been part of, and then some other partner projects, just to highlight a few. And there's so many along the Texas coast, so I just narrowed down some ones that a couple I was part of, and then the others I was familiar with. So at the end, I will ask if you have success stories in your communities that you want to share. We would love to hear about those and see how we can support them. So before I was hired, Texas Sea Grant used to be part of the coastal wetland restoration, or Texas Coastal Watershed Program, and they had an internship for 6 students, and they took their spring breaks to learn how to propagate, ID, and they participated in wetland planting, and they got that hands-on experience. And there was a particular project with the same group, not the same group of students, but Sheldon Lake State Park is it's a really interesting and unique type of restoration. They took aerial photography from 1930 and they determined where those original wetland boundaries were. And the reason for that is at that current time, that land that was formerly wetlands were agricultural lands and had been developed. So they wanted to restore it back to its original ecosystem. So re-excavation to restore, which is neat. And I don't know of many projects like that. So then they densely planted vegetation, and there were various phases because they dealt with quite a large scale project. There was a drought, I think, in the second year that affected and slowed the project, but it is successful still and doing well today. And last summer, I was privileged to work with Master Naturalists, Aransas County Long-Term Recovery, and A&M Corpus Christi students, undergraduate students that were completing an environmental internship as part of their curriculum requirements. So we all teamed up, and after Harvey, there were two identified sites that were most impacted by invasive species coming in after the storm exposed bare ground with all those high winds. So we selected two manageable sites. They were small so that this smaller group could effectively manage it. And as we move forward, this is a continual project that we'll keep maintaining, because if you don't, the work, some of the removal, some of those invasives could come back, and sometimes you see more of the natives come back, which is what you want. But long-term maintenance is part of this. So that some of these, this is part of the team here. The students also got to assess quadrants, transects, and collect species data to help inform for future planning if there were new species, what had changed about the property. And then the last photo is actual removal of St. Augustine grass, which is unfortunately used as lawn for most residential properties. So when it gets out in the wild, it's very aggressive and spreads quickly. And so it would be great to see in the future. There's some programs where they're trying to encourage planting of natives from a residential perspective. And then now they're seeing pipeline companies that have their right-of-ways. They partner with native seed companies to plant native vegetation, which is great because those are more large-scale projects. This inventory was done back in 2012. Two former Sea Grant extension specialists surveyed various communities and identified quite a few sites. These are just a few of them, and in bold, the Magnolia Inlet is one of the projects that was selected to be funded. There were limited funds, so they had to pick based on, the proposals put in and the needs. They selected Magnolia Inlet as one of them, which I'll go into here. Hydrological restoration is actually quite a bit cheaper than manually removing or equipment having to go into either spray or manually remove invasives or planting and seeding. They were able to open up with county equipment, I believe the county provided, where there was a blockage from freshwater inflows, and that completely changed that the living resources and the vegetation, and obviously the species that lived there. The fishing, it was noticed by fishermen, and a landowner private landowner, the county, and researcher Dr. Rusty Egan worked on this, and it was quite a bit of work, but the results have been very impressive, and it's still healthy, and they've seen the right vegetation come back, tidal activity expanded, and the fishermen are pretty happy with the results as well. Half Moon Reef restoration was a giant project between the Nature Conservancy, I believe, foundations, former Texas Sea Grant specialists. This resulted in, improvements in water quality, because oysters naturally, they filter water. The biodiversity increased significantly with biomass as well. So this is a good example of living resources restoration and water quality overlap. A current project that has actually been extended due to COVID limiting or prohibiting having in-person workshops is watershed protection planning in Baffin Bay. And obviously, in these early stages, this is the assessment and planning and partnerships phase. So there's not on the ground projects being implemented and executed right now, but this is an example of what it looks like to get that process going. It's prioritization that comes from the local feedback, so that while there's research going on and monitoring going on, this information from the community feeds in to better inform what some of these sources of non-point source pollution are. And so this is the overall goal, is to improve water quality, because there are impairments on the bay system and the tributaries that feed it. I would say that the Texas Master Naturalists are some of the most active in restoration throughout the state. You can see all the chapters in colors, and along the coast there are 4, 5, 6, at least 6 chapters. The ones that are immediately adjacent to the Gulf, and more if you consider, the three counties in is what we consider coastal. And the areas that are blank, there's opportunities to develop, to start chapters there. But a few examples of some of the work they do. John O'Connell, our Ag Extension agent in Brazoria County, he advises the Cradle of Texas chapter, and some of their projects include seed collecting. They do brush management. They contribute to protection of the habitats and work on the preserves and work with the communities. And some other chapters do similar work. The Mid-Coast chapter that I got to work with, they also collect, propagate, and distribute plants. One of the projects right now is working with the International Crane Foundation. They're trying to identify the most critical places within the county and the region that would benefit from actually the plants being distributed to those areas and then planted. So that's still in progress. And in the South Texas border chapter, which is second from the bottom on the image there, they have some smaller scale, beautification, pollinator gardens, and they are really heavy into education and outreach. There's an app called iNaturalist that you can snap a photo of a plant that you aren't sure what the species is, and people will respond with what it is. And if you get several people that are indicating the same, then you can learn species, and it helps as an inventory tool as well. So citizen science, these guys do it all, and Master Naturalists are especially the ones I worked with this past summer, 2019, became my mentors. Another aspect of restoration and conservation, we talked a little bit about with the Baffin Bay project, but there are, through the EPA, TCEQ and the Texas State Soil and Water Board, and then Coastal Nonpoint Pollution Control Program are all three programs that aim to reduce basically the pollution that comes from runoff. It's Nonpoint's considered kind of a collective pollution, whereas if it's point source, it's coming from a pipe, it's a maybe a wastewater treatment system or discharge pipe. And so being Nonpoint, being collective, running off all the land is difficult to manage. And so parts of some of these success stories, which EPA has links to their full, plans and what they did and what was approved. Some of them are in early stages, like the Baffin Bay one, but restoration examples, it's very common that you have riparian, stream and shoreline restoration. So living shorelines, they call riparian areas where you plant and you remove invasives, because those are the last lines of defense as far as runoff goes, and to whatever water body, they are the last line of defense to filter out the pollutants. There's easements, educational efforts, lots of wetland work along the coast, and then heavy outreach. And then some examples from other agencies and partners in the state. This is actually just across from A&M Corpus Christi, along Oso Bay and the Sutter Wildlife Refuge. I don't know who did this project, if it was the city, but they did use concrete to stabilize where there was some significant erosion, and it actually extends pretty well beyond this area, this angle. And this is a really impressive project. 6,200 acres were acquired on South Padre Island, and it's the second largest land acquisition in at least Texas, next to the Nature Conservancy doing another, they did a 25,000 acre restoration years ago. But using Deepwater Horizon funds, they were able to conserve this piece of land, and it also happens to be part of why it was selected is that it's habitat for Kemp Ridley sea turtles, which are endangered. So multifaceted, benefits for storm surge and flooding, and because that, again, that last line of defense on a barrier island, it's really not really where there should be much development, as it is very inherently risky with weather to have residential structures. And then the research side, which at first, like I said, thinking about restoration is picturing being out in the field and planting and doing manual work. But some of how that's directed, how that those projects get decided, are often a result of research that's done, so that the resource managers have tools and support for putting a project together to be most successful. So that might be spatial evaluations, looking at water quality data, critical areas, all help. One, pick site selections, ideal times of year to complete projects, avoiding migratory bird seasons and any endangered species activity. There's so many components that research can really assist to make a project successful. Drew, do I have any questions so far?
No questions at the moment. Feel free to chat, type in your questions in the Q&A, and we'll answer them.
All right, thank you. So just some titles of actual research funded by Texas Sea Grant. Nearly 50 years, Sea Grant has been around, and I wanted to pull any projects that had to do with resource management and ecosystems. So I kind of underlined how it was related to restoration, studying dynamics, responses for regime shifts, conservation. So these, 1985 are the first two, 2017 and 2015 are listed there. And then, there are studies back in the 70s and 80s that I just pulled some of the most obvious ones to me. Transformation of ecosystems, because we do know they're adaptive if they inherently adapt to changes in other, to currents and to climate. And so that first study is looking into how an ecosystem transforms. And then I mentioned spatial valuations. This one is particularly for agricultural lands, which obviously is a crucial part of watershed planning. Also, one that might not be quite as obvious, but it is to do with engineering an ecosystem. So bringing in more of the economic side and the animal component of ecosystems. And those are just a few that I selected. So running through projects that Sea Grant was part of, our external partner projects, research that supports making restoration decisions. It's just a summary of what this was about today. I hope that you gained something, or it sparked for you maybe to a project you know of that you could share with us, or something that you're thinking about being part of and want any technical assistance with. And this is the reference page, obviously, and my contact information. Feel free to email me anytime, and I'm happy to set up a call or Zoom meeting and chat further about any questions and restoration ecosystem discussions. Drew, the chat box still empty?
We do have a couple of questions, so we are going to switch over to those. And Morgan, you can see the questions?
Yes, I just pulled up that first question. I am grabbing the article so I can answer that one. Yes, correct. I misspelled that. And I can, is it okay if I stop my screen share and pull up that article? Just to
yes, go ahead.
Okay. I'll just do that really quickly to make sure I'm answering.
While Morgan's working on that, are there any other questions? No.
I apologize. I thought I had that laying right next to me, so I am.
So Morgan is working on the spelling of Magnolia Inlet.
The chat, the way it was corrected in that chat, and then I was just verifying that it was the southwest side of Matagorda Bay in Calhoun County.
Could you elaborate on that a little bit, Morgan?
So this is a project that was removing a barrier that had been put in. It was man-made, and it had impaired tidal flow and freshwater inflows. So as a partnership between, I can send the article, but there was a particular landowner that allowed access to his land, and the county brought in bulldozers to physically remove that barrier. And then Dr. Egan, that we had funded, he was a huge support. And I know there are other partners that I'm missing here, but it essentially restored, I think it said 600 or 700 acres overall once it was complete, and the system kind of balanced out. So it was considered a big success.
Okay. And then our next question is, when do you expect the NRDA to go to the next round?
The next round, I haven't gotten notification. I'm subscribed to those emails, so I would have to get back to y'all on that. If you would put your email in the chat, I can send you information on that. And that, I'm not sure if you're asking about the, there was a full watershed protection plan funded for Petronilla and San Fernando Creek. And that is, that's different funding, that's EPA funding. And that is starting now, the planning phase is starting now. So anyone that wants articles from these success stories, just enter your email there, and I will follow up with those. I closed out the windows so that it wouldn't affect the broadband, but I can send all of those. I have them marked, and they're actually in the references. The last question about how long will the planning take on the Petronilla? It's a 2-year project, so it's a combination of more prioritization so that specific projects and areas can be identified, along with research. So the early phase project we're doing now will provide kind of that the stakeholder buy-in that can help identify sites, and while that is being done, they are expanding monitoring and acquired money for more research. So by the end of the 2 years, they will have a full plan submitted for review. The question about the project, the barrier removal for the restoring the flows. If you could put your email or send me an email, because I don't see it here in the chat, because I'll get that article to you. Drew, my screen isn't sharing anymore, is it? I think you're muted. Can y'all hear me? Let's see. Maybe if you can put in the chat whether you can.
Sorry. Yes. How long will the planning take on Petronolia?
Oh, that's the 2-year project I was talking about for the watershed protection plan funded by EPA. Okay. And I'm actually pulling up right now I'm going to share my screen.
Go ahead.
For share. Oops. So there's an article with the correct spelling, and I apologize for that. And it has all the partners listed: Calhoun County, state, federal, private citizens and industry were all involved. There's the landowner's name here. Let's see. And then one of the former Sea Grant extension agents, Rhonda Cummings, was a big part of the planning and the full project. Part of what brought this up was a fish kill and just noticing changes in fisheries. But this, I will put this link into the chat. And there were actually 2 sides blocked on that site. I will stop the share. And thank you for that question. I appreciate your patience as I got the answers, because all the projects I don't have all the details memorized, because these are before I came on board. Drew, can you see the link there?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, so in the chat, you'll see a link to the article. We have one more question. What would you say is the most important up and coming project in the next few years to preserve ocean life in the Texas coast?
Well, that is a great question. I personally am a proponent of easements and land acquisition, because it's on a large scale, because you are conserving a large scale continual piece of land that is immediately shoreline to the Gulf of Mexico. So by doing that, it's a huge buffer for storms, flooding, hurricanes, and you're protecting life and property that could otherwise have been developed into residential and community infrastructure like hospitals and schools. You really don't want that kind of development as much as you can help it on near the shoreline, especially in areas. Well, really, the whole Texas coast is as people have seen, especially recently, very vulnerable to hurricanes. And if you do have structures near the shoreline, they should be on pier and beam. And I think you're going to see more managed retreat projects happening where land acquisition is a preferred and effective method of conserving. And so I'm not a particular area of a particular project, but that's the best I can answer that question just from my point of view. Any more questions?
Okay, well, you're working on your questions for Morgan. We have another survey we would like to ask you, just 2 simple questions.
And thank you again for participating in the poll. Part of how we measure our program effectiveness is how well we can assist with behavioral change for what the community's needs are to protect and provide stewardship to the coast, and from an environmental and economically balanced position. Is the poll closed out now, Drew?
Just a few more people voting. I'll give it one more second. And if there are no further questions, Morgan, would you like to discuss anything else, or?
I just wanted to thank you again for your time, and you know, the transition to virtual education is a learning process, and I'm thankful my dogs didn't bark in the background, and hope you learned something and can provide any information. Like I said, part of our jobs is to assess community need and hear from coastal communities. And if you're not on the coast, we'd still love to hear any questions or feedback. So that's all I have. Thank you again.
Thank you, everyone. We have one last question. Morgan, if you want to take it before we leave.
Do I do consultations? I can provide technical assistance and resources. So I'm happy to have a phone call, or if you got my email there, I'll put it again in this chat box. But in some of our ag extension agents that are dual appointed with Sea Grant actually do go out on sites because they're county based, and they do sometimes do site visits. But I am happy to have a conversation and see how I can help you. And I do work on the whole coast, so. Texas coast. Any more?
That looks like it's it.
All right. Well, Drew, are you going to close it out if there's nothing else?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and please join us in 2 weeks for our next Seaside Chats.